Do you know why we're here today, Sister Deborah?
I assume it's about the missing funds from the parish accounts.
For nearly 2 decades, Deborah True ran Holy Cross Catholic Church without a single person checking her work. The account she and Father Murphy hid from the diocese contained $1.5 million of parishioner donations, and it was about to be found.
We've been looking into the church's financial records from the past few years.
I understand.
$1,500,000, 8 years, 1 Catholic parish on the Florida coast, 1 pastor, dead 18 months before any of it surfaced, and 1 woman, 69 years old, walking through the doors of the Indian River County Jail with a folder under her arm, who had spent the last 23 years sitting at the front desk of Holy Cross Catholic Church in Vero Beach. The investigation that brought her to that booking window had taken 9 months. The scheme it uncovered had taken twice that long to build and almost a decade to run. By the end of this footage, Deborah True would be processed, photographed, and booked on first-degree grand theft. I have to ask, have you ever written a check to your church, to a charity, to your kid's school, without thinking for a single second about whether the people on the other end were treating that money the way you intended? Drop a comment and let me know what crossed your mind when you heard that figure. Subscribe if you're new here. We hold institutions accountable on this channel every single week, and the deeper you get into this one, the heavier it lands. Deborah True was born in 1953 in northern Indiana. Her father worked as a tool and die machinist at a small auto parts supplier outside Fort Wayne. Her mother worked at the Parish Elementary School as a lunchroom supervisor. The True household was Catholic in the way that mattered most to mid-century Midwestern Catholic families. Mass every Sunday morning, fish on Fridays, the rosary on the front room end table, a small framed picture of the Sacred Heart above the kitchen sink. Deborah was the third of 5 children. She was a quiet girl, by all accounts, the kind of child who finished her homework before dinner and helped her mother fold laundry without being asked. She learned to type at 14 on a Royal Quiet Deluxe her father had bought secondhand for $42 at an estate sale on a snowy Saturday morning in the winter of 1967. By 16, she could take dictation in shorthand. By 18, she had been hired part-time at the rectory of her home parish, answering phones and filing mass intentions for a stipend of $40 a week. The pastor she worked for in those years would later, in a letter of reference, describe her as the most reliable young employee he had ever supervised. She finished a 2-year secretarial program at a Fort Wayne business college in 1973. Her first full-time job paid $140 a week, typing insurance policies at a regional Catholic mutual. She married at 22, a young man she had met through her parish's young adult group, an accountant who worked for a small firm downtown. The marriage lasted 6 years. There were no children. The divorce was quiet, undramatic, and final, and Deborah True never spoke about it to anyone at any of her later parishes. After the divorce, she moved to Central Florida, then south to the Treasure Coast in the early 1980s, drawn by the climate and by the work. Florida in the 1980s was building Catholic churches as fast as it was building condominiums. Retirees from the north were flooding the coast. New parishes were being carved out of old ones. Old parishes were doubling in size, and a competent Catholic woman who could keep a parish office running was in demand at every diocese on the coast. She worked at 3 parishes between 1983 and 1996. Her references uniformly described her as exceptionally organized, discreet, the kind of administrator a pastor could rely on for everything, the kind of person who could be trusted with confidential parish matters, and who never repeated a word of anything she heard in the rectory. One pastor's letter from 1991 called her the most capable parish secretary he had worked with in 30 years of priestly ministry. Another described her as a quiet, devoted servant of the church. She did not marry again. She lived alone in a small ranch-style house off 27th Avenue in Vero Beach, drove a sensible Toyota sedan that she kept washed and serviced on schedule, and was known at her own parish, not Holy Cross, but the parish she attended on her off Sundays, as a daily communicant. She was the kind of woman who, if you had described her to a casting director and asked for the Catholic parish administrator of central casting, would have walked through the door. In 1997, Holy Cross Catholic Church in Vero Beach received a new pastor. His name was Father Richard Patrick Murphy, called Dick by everyone who knew him for more than a week. Father Murphy was 57 years old, ordained in the Archdiocese of Boston, transferred to the Diocese of Palm Beach in the late 1980s. He was a big man, 6'2", broad across the shoulders, a booming voice that filled the nave without a microphone. And he came to Holy Cross with a reputation as a builder. He had taken 2 other Florida parishes through capital campaigns. The diocese expected him to do the same for the growing congregation in Vero Beach. Father Murphy needed a parish administrator. He interviewed 3 candidates in his first month. He hired Deborah True before the second interview was over. She was 44 years old. Within 6 months, she was running the parish office, the bulletin, the sacramental records, the mass schedule, the volunteer coordination, the rectory accounts, and the pastor's personal calendar. Within 2 years, she had become, as one parishioner would later describe her in a letter to the court, the heart of Holy Cross. Father Murphy's homilies named her by first name from the pulpit at least once a year. She was, in every visible way, his right hand. She also, less visibly, became his caregiver. Father Murphy was a heavy man with a heavy man's health. Diabetes diagnosed in his early 60s, 2 cardiac events in his late 60s, mobility problems in his 70s that made it difficult for him to live alone in the rectory without help. Deborah True brought him groceries. She drove him to medical appointments. She picked up his prescriptions. She sat with him in hospital waiting rooms. She handled the small, private dignities of an aging priest's life that the institution of the church does not always handle well on its own. Father Murphy's obituary, when it was eventually written in March of 2020, would describe her as his longtime secretary and his caregiver. And that single sentence captured a relationship of more than 2 decades in which the lines between pastoral work, administrative work, and personal care had thoroughly dissolved. By 2010, Deborah True had been at Holy Cross for 13 years. Father Murphy had been pastor for 13 years. Together, they had taken the parish through 2 renovations, a Catholic school addition, 3 capital campaigns, and the slow demographic shift that turned Vero Beach from a sleepy retirement town into a growing year-round Catholic community. The annual offertory income at Holy Cross had grown from roughly $700,000 a year to nearly $1.5 million. The Diocese of Palm Beach considered the parish a model of stable, well-administered Catholic life on the Treasure Coast. Father Murphy was named in the diocese's annual report 2 years running. Deborah True was, by every metric the diocese tracked, an exemplary parish administrator. She was also, by 2010, 62 years old, divorced, childless, with a modest pension on the horizon and a personal debt load. Credit cards, a second mortgage on the 27th Avenue house, a small line of credit at the credit union, that she had not been able to retire on a parish administrator's salary. She earned $46,000 a year. Her debts, when investigators would eventually total them, exceeded $120,000 and were growing. A Catholic parish is, financially, a strange thing. It is not a freestanding nonprofit. It is not, in the corporate sense, a subsidiary of the diocese. It is a canonical entity, a juridic person under church law, whose pastor is its legal representative and whose finances are subject to oversight by the Diocesan Finance Office. In the Diocese of Palm Beach, that oversight took the same form it takes in most American dioceses. Each parish maintained its operating accounts at a bank designated and approved by diocesan policy. Each parish filed an annual financial report with the diocesan chancery. Each parish was subject to periodic audit by diocesan finance staff. The pastor signed the checks. The Parish Finance Council, a small group of lay volunteers, was supposed to meet quarterly and review the books. The Diocesan Finance Office reconciled what the parish reported against what the diocesan bank reported. That was the system. And the system, on paper, was sound. It assumed two things that almost always held true. First, that the pastor was a man of good faith who would not deceive his own diocese. Second, that the parish administrator working for him would not, either. For 999 parishes out of 1,000, those assumptions held. They held at Holy Cross, too, for most of Father Murphy's tenure. They held until they didn't. The vulnerability was not in the audit. It was not in the Finance Council. It was not in the diocesan reconciliation. The vulnerability was in the name. A Catholic parish in the United States does not, in most cases, hold a federal trademark on its own name. The phrase Holy Cross Catholic Church appears in dioceses from Maine to California. There are parishes called Holy Cross in at least 40 states. There are Holy Cross schools, Holy Cross cemeteries, Holy Cross retreat houses, Holy Cross foundations. A bank, presented with two reasonably authoritative-looking individuals, a Catholic priest with a Roman collar and a clergy ID, and a parish administrator with 2 decades of operational documentation and a parish letterhead in her hand, has no mechanism and no obligation to verify that the account they are opening in the name of Holy Cross Catholic Church is the same account the Diocese of Palm Beach happens to know about. A bank verifies the signatories. It verifies the entity exists. It verifies the federal employer identification number if one is provided. It does not call the diocese. It does not ask whether there is already an account elsewhere. It does not, in 2012, in a mid-sized branch on the Florida coast, have any reason at all to question the pastor of a 15-year parish and the administrator who has run his office for 15 of those years. The Diocese of Palm Beach, for its part, audited what it knew existed. Its annual reconciliation pulled records from the diocese-designated bank. If a parish had an additional account at a different bank under the parish's exact legal name with the pastor as signatory, the diocesan auditor had no automatic way to discover it. The diocese could only check the books it knew about. It could not check the books it didn't. That was the gap. It was not a flaw in any specific policy. It was a structural feature of how American Catholic parish finance works in dioceses with hundreds of parishes and finite audit resources. The system trusted the pastor. The system trusted the administrator. The system did not and could not independently verify that no parallel set of books existed. For 13 years at Holy Cross, that trust was warranted. In 2012, it stopped being. The account was opened on a weekday morning in early 2012 at a community bank branch a short drive from the Holy Cross campus. The exact date and the specific institution would later appear in police records. What matters here is the procedure. Father Richard Murphy walked into the branch wearing his clerical collar, accompanied by Deborah True, his parish administrator of 15 years. They presented identification. They presented a copy of the parish's articles and a parish letterhead. They opened a business checking account in the name Holy Cross Catholic Church. Both of them were named as authorized signatories. They left with a deposit slip pad, a starter checkbook, and a new account number. The Diocese of Palm Beach was not informed. The Parish Finance Council was not informed. The bookkeeper who reconciled Holy Cross's diocesan account each month was not informed. The new account existed only in the awareness of 2 people, the pastor and the administrator, and in the records of a bank that had no reason to mention it to anyone. For the first few months, the account sat largely dormant. A few deposits, a few transfers. The 2 signatories were testing the mechanism, learning the bank's procedures, watching for any unexpected notification that might travel back to the diocese. None came. By 2013, the deposits began to flow more steadily. By 2015, the year police would eventually identify as the start of the documented losses, the parallel account had become a steady second channel for parishioner donations. The mechanism of diversion was almost invisible. Parishioners writing weekly offering checks made them out to Holy Cross Catholic Church, exactly as they always had, exactly as the bulletin instructed, exactly as the offering envelope specified. Those checks entered the parish office through the same channels as every other check. Most went where they were supposed to go. Some did not. The administrator who processed the deposits each Monday morning had complete discretion over which checks were endorsed for deposit into the diocesan account and which were endorsed for deposit into the parallel account. The endorsement stamp read the same on either deposit slip. The bank accepted either deposit without question. The parishioner's own bank, processing the check, saw a payment made out to Holy Cross Catholic Church, cleared against an account in the name of Holy Cross Catholic Church. The check cleared. The donor received their canceled check back from their own bank. Nothing in that paper trail revealed that the money had gone to the wrong Holy Cross Catholic Church. Special collections moved the same way. Memorial mass donations moved the same way. Capital campaign pledges, when paid in monthly installments by check, moved the same way. The fraction of any given week's offertory that ended up in the parallel account was small enough to evade any reasonable suspicion. 20%, 30%, never the full take. The diocesan account continued to receive most of the donations. The parish continued to pay its bills, fund its programs, file its annual report. The audit, when it came each year, reconciled the diocesan account against the diocesan books, and the books balanced. What did not balance, what did not appear anywhere in any document the Diocese of Palm Beach ever saw, was the second account. Between 2015 and 2020, the 5-year window that police would later specify in the affidavit, that second account received approximately $1.5 million in parishioner donations. From it, more than $500,000 went to pay down Deborah True's personal debts, credit card balances, a second mortgage, a car loan, a line of credit at the credit union, direct payments to creditors, drawn against an account that bore the parish's name and the pastor's signature authority. Another $147,000 transferred from the parallel account into Deborah True's personal checking account in a series of transactions spread across several years. Never large enough at one time to trigger any federal reporting threshold, never small enough to be lost in the noise of an ordinary checking history. The remainder, roughly $850,000, moved in ways that police would later describe with the same careful phrase used in the affidavit. The funds personally benefited Father Murphy. The phrasing was deliberate. The mechanics of that $850,000 were never fully detailed in any public document. Father Murphy was dead. The diocese had not pursued the question further. What investigators could establish, and what they did not need to establish in granular detail, because the man it would have been used against was no longer subject to prosecution, was that the money left the account, that Father Murphy was a signatory, and that the disbursements served his personal interest in a manner the parish's legitimate accounts would not have permitted. The escalation across the 8 years of the account's operation was gradual. The first year, perhaps $80,000 passed through. By the middle years, the annual flow approached $300,000. By the last full year before Father Murphy's death, the account moved nearly $400,000 in 12 months. Nobody at the Diocese of Palm Beach noticed. Nobody at the Parish Finance Council noticed. The parishioners themselves, writing checks to their church for the small and ordinary acts of Catholic giving, for a memorial mass for a deceased spouse, for the parish school's annual fund drive, for the weekly envelope dropped in the basket on Sunday morning, had no way of knowing that any fraction of their donations was being routed to anywhere other than the place they intended. For 8 years, the second set of books existed. For 8 years, no audit found them. Father Richard Patrick Murphy died on March 22, 2020, at the age of 80. The cause of death was a cardiac event at his rectory, where he had been living for the last years of his pastorate. He had been at Holy Cross for almost 23 years. The parish was in the early weeks of the pandemic shutdown when he died. The Mass had moved online. The school was closed. The diocese, like every diocese in the country, was preoccupied with the logistics of a religious life suddenly conducted at distance. His funeral was small, pandemic restrictions limited attendance, but the obituary that ran in the Vero Beach paper and on the parish website was full and warm. It described him as a beloved pastor, a builder, a man of deep faith. It listed the parishes he had served. It listed the diocesan committees on which he had sat. It named, by first name, the woman who had served as his secretary and his caregiver for the longest stretch of his pastorate. Deborah True, 23 years. The Diocese of Palm Beach appointed an administrator pro tem to Holy Cross within the week. Within a month, a new pastor was assigned. Within 3 months, the standard post-mortem reconciliation of a deceased pastor's parish books had begun. That reconciliation is routine. When a long-tenured pastor dies, the Diocesan Finance Office assembles a complete picture of the parish's financial state at the moment of death. Outstanding bills, pending pledges, account balances, vendor obligations. The new pastor needs to know what he is inheriting. The diocese needs to confirm that nothing was left in an unsettled state. For most parishes, the work takes a few weeks of paperwork. At Holy Cross, the work took longer. There were anomalies. The diocesan account balance was lower than the historical pattern suggested it should be. Capital campaign pledges from the previous 3 years had not all been accounted for. A memorial fund that parishioners had contributed to in honor of a longtime parishioner who had died in 2018 showed disbursements that did not match its stated purpose. None of the anomalies, individually, were dispositive. Collectively, they were the kind of thing a diocesan finance officer notices. Through 2020 and into 2021, the Diocesan Finance Office pulled records. They cross-referenced parishioner donation receipts, the year-end statements the parish sent each donor for tax purposes, against the diocesan account deposits. The numbers did not match. Parishioners had been giving more than the diocesan account had been receiving. Where the difference was small, it could be explained as timing or pledge variance. Where the difference was large, it could not. By the late summer of 2021, the Diocese of Palm Beach had identified the existence of donations that had not reached the diocesan books. By the fall of 2021, the diocese had identified a second bank account in the parish's name at a bank the diocese did not use. By December of 2021, the diocese contacted the Vero Beach Police Department and formally referred the matter for criminal investigation. The catalyst, then, was a routine post-mortem audit. Father Murphy, dead since the previous March, was beyond reach. Deborah True, 68 years old, still living quietly in her ranch house off 27th Avenue, was not. The investigation that the Vero Beach Police Department opened in December of 2021 took 9 months to complete. The detectives assigned to it did not need to develop the case from a cold start. The Diocese of Palm Beach had handed them the spine of it, the parallel account, the records, the year-end donor statements that did not reconcile. What the detectives built around that spine was the evidentiary structure that would survive in a Florida courtroom. They obtained the bank records for the parallel account from the date of its opening in 2012 through the date of Father Murphy's death in March 2020. They obtained the personal banking records of Deborah True. They obtained the records of the creditors to whom payments had flowed from the parallel account. The credit card companies, the mortgage servicer, the credit union. They obtained the diocesan account records. They obtained copies of parishioner checks that had cleared against the parallel account. Checks made out to Holy Cross Catholic Church that had ended up deposited into the wrong Holy Cross Catholic Church account. Each one of those checks was a single, complete piece of evidence. The donor's name, the donor's signature, the donor's intent on the memo line, and the back of the check stamped with the endorsement that had directed it into the parallel account. The detectives identified the disposition of more than $500,000 of the proceeds as direct payments against Deborah True's personal debts. They identified an additional $147,000 in direct transfers from the parallel account into True's personal checking account. They identified the remaining $850,000, approximately, as having been dispersed in a manner that served Father Murphy's personal benefit. Murphy was dead. No criminal case would be opened against him. The detectives noted this finding in the affidavit and moved on. The case against Deborah True converged on what could be proven about Deborah True. The proof was straightforward. Her signature was on the account opening documents. Her name was on the signatory card. Her endorsement stamp had directed parishioner checks into the account. The payments to her creditors were direct from the account. The transfers into her personal checking were direct from the account. $647,000 in personal benefit was, by the time the detectives closed the file, fully documented. Stories like this don't get the attention they deserve. If you want to see more accountability coverage on cases the mainstream press buries inside one quiet news cycle, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're heading into the legal proceedings now. The surrender, the plea, the sentencing exposure, the restitution structure. Stick with me. The way this one closes is harder to sit with than the dollar amounts. In September of 2022, with the affidavit complete and the warrant drawn, Deborah True's attorney was notified. On September 19, 2022, Deborah True drove herself to the Indian River County Jail. She did not require an arrest at her home. She turned herself in. The intake video from the Indian River County Jail on the morning of September 19, 2022, is brief and procedural. Deborah True arrived at the booking entrance shortly before 9 in the morning. She was 69 years old, gray-haired, wearing a plain navy blouse and slacks, carrying a manila folder and a small purse. She was accompanied by her attorney. She was not in handcuffs. She walked through the doors under her own power. The booking officer was a deputy with 7 years on the job. The exchange, as recorded on the booking area camera, was professional and short. "Ma'am, I need you to confirm your name and date of birth." Deborah True, June 17, 1953. "Do you understand the charges you're being booked on this morning?" "Yes." "First-degree grand theft and fraud." "Yes." "Have you been advised of your rights by counsel?" "I have." "Do you have any statement you'd like to make at this time?" "No, thank you." "Step over to the wall, please, for the photograph." She stepped over to the wall. The booking photograph was taken. The fingerprint scan was completed. Her personal effects were inventoried. Her attorney remained in the booking area for the duration. The exchange contained no admission, no denial, no justification. There was no breakdown. There was no outburst. There was no plea for understanding. There was a 69-year-old woman who had decided, on her attorney's advice, that the procedural cooperation of self-surrender was the most rational response to a warrant that was not going to disappear. She was processed. She was released on bond the same afternoon. The case moved into the pretrial phase. Father Murphy, dead by then for 2 years and 6 months, was not mentioned in the booking record. He would not be mentioned in the indictment. The criminal proceeding from that moment forward concerned one defendant. The case against Deborah True moved slowly through the Florida Circuit Court calendar. Pretrial motions occupied much of 2023. The defense did not seriously contest the existence of the parallel account or the disposition of the funds. Those facts were documented by bank records that could not be plausibly challenged. The defense did contest the precise allocation of personal benefit between True and the deceased Father Murphy, and the precise restitution figure that the state would seek. The prosecution, for its part, did not press for the full $1.5 million in restitution against True alone. Half of it, at minimum, had benefited a man who was beyond the court's reach. The state focused on what it could prove True had personally received. Plea negotiations occupied the fall of 2024 and the early months of 2025. Assistant State Attorney William Long handled the prosecution. True's counsel negotiated a plea that resolved the criminal exposure without trial. On May 1, 2025, in a Florida Circuit courtroom in Indian River County, Deborah True pleaded no contest to 1 count of first-degree grand theft. A plea of no contest, under Florida law, is not an admission of guilt. It is an acknowledgement that the prosecution possesses sufficient evidence to obtain a conviction at trial. It produces the same legal consequences as a guilty plea. The court accepts it. The sentence is imposed. The judgment is entered. The sentencing exposure was significant. First-degree grand theft in Florida, for amounts above $100,000, carries a maximum of 30 years in state prison. The negotiated exposure for True was capped at up to 10 years in state prison, followed by up to 20 years of probation. The restitution figure was set at approximately $700,000, substantially less than the $1.5 million identified by police, reflecting what prosecutors could establish as directly attributable to True's personal benefit. The restitution would be paid in monthly installments. Assistant State Attorney Long was specific in his on-the-record comments about the consequences of non-payment. If True failed to maintain the monthly schedule, she would face being returned to prison. The Diocese of Palm Beach issued a written statement following the plea. The statement was carefully worded. It expressed gratitude to the Vero Beach Police Department and the State Attorney's Office for the investigation and prosecution. It expressed regret for the breach of trust the case had revealed. It noted, with deliberate emphasis, that the current pastor at Holy Cross Catholic Church had no involvement in any of the matters underlying the case, that the parish remained operational, and that the parishioners of Holy Cross continued to be served by an active and lawful pastoral team. It did not address the structural question of how a parallel bank account in the parish's exact name had operated undetected for 8 years within a diocesan oversight system that was supposed to make precisely that kind of arrangement impossible. That question, the statement implied without ever stating, had been addressed through internal changes to diocesan financial protocols. The specific changes were not enumerated. The parishioners of Holy Cross, the men and women whose Sunday envelopes, whose memorial mass donations, whose capital campaign pledges had funded the scheme, were not invited to make victim impact statements at sentencing. There was no individual victim in the criminal sense. The class of victim was the congregation as a whole, and the institutional victim was the diocese itself. One longtime Holy Cross parishioner, a woman in her 70s who had attended the parish for 19 years and had written a memorial mass check for her late husband in 2017, was quoted briefly in a follow-up news article. "I gave it to my church," she said. "I gave it to my pastor. I thought I was doing a good thing. I still think I was doing a good thing. I just wish the people who took it had been the people I gave it to." Deborah True was sentenced under the terms of the plea agreement. She was 69 years old at the time of her plea, with 2 decades of probation and restitution stretching beyond her natural life expectancy. The criminal arc of the case was closed. The structural arc was not. Father Richard Patrick Murphy, the pastor of Holy Cross from 1997 to 2020, remained, in the obituary the parish had published in March of 2020, in the framed photograph that had hung in the parish hall, in the homilies the parishioners remembered, a beloved figure to the people he had served. The truth of his role in the scheme had been established by the investigation, named in the police affidavit, and never tested at trial because the law cannot prosecute a man who is already dead. The diocese had drawn a line, the current pastor not involved, the parish continuing, the past addressed. The line was administratively necessary. It did not answer the deeper question of what 23 years of pastoral life had been, alongside 8 years of a hidden account that bore the church's name. The parishioners of Holy Cross had mourned their pastor in March of 2020. They had not yet known. They would learn it slowly over the next 3 years, news article after news article, and they would carry the knowledge into every future Sunday at the parish he had built and stolen from in equal measure. That was what the case left behind. This case was quiet, but the next one on your screen is louder, and the betrayal cuts even deeper. Click it now.